Praveen Tilakaratne. Good morning. Thank you for coming to talk to me in the Ataramadhyava channel about the Sinhala Journal Pravada, which I think you edit, right? And I'm very grateful for you being part of the mini series I run called Alternative Spaces for Education, because through this, I want to tell people how important articles and essays carrying knowledge that will help anyone is available free of charge on the internet, or if they want to go to a library as a journal, so that they have a knowledge that education is not something far away from them. It's accessible to anyone who has a desire to learn. So thank you very much for being part of this process. Can we start by me asking you who you are actually, Praveen, what you do? I know you're at Cornel University in the USA. Just give us a quick explanation.
Thanks, Madhubhashini. Also, because we went through the same thing in Sinhala, now I think this conversation would be more, I don't know, structured and less chaotic, but that's a bad thing, I guess.
Pravada, Praveen, probably not, knowing both of us.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be structured, so please feel free.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, I'm reading for my PhD at Cornell University, and I study comparative literature. And before that, I studied at the University of Colombo, and I majored or specialized in English literature.
Yeah. Okay. What happened to the master's, Praveen? Did you not do that, or did you jump straight to a PhD? What is the situation there?
Yeah, so I didn't do a master's. I did 1 year's worth of after graduation. I did some this postgraduate diploma thing at Pravada, in the philosophy department there. And then directly after that, I came here for straight for the PhD. This is something we talked about in the Sinhala one as well, that in comparative literature, at least there are only very few places here that seem to be giving terminal master's degrees, and maybe that's also related to the way in which academic markets are structured and how vocational lives relating to the academia are structured, which is also something that would be very important for us when talking about knowledge production in vernacular languages, because it's always a market-driven process and can't escape these.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, is it subject-based, or generally is the US not looking to, market terminal masters in any subject?
I don't know, actually. I don't think I know enough to answer that question in any authoritative way, but I think that it depends on the discipline. I think for English, at least, there still seem to be more terminal masters. Maybe relates more to what people want to do after getting a master's degree, because complete comparative literature seems to be a very I don't know, in a sense, you after getting a degree in it, perhaps the only spaces that are open for you are academic spaces. You can't teach, for example, in a high school with a it doesn't really translate into anything other than the academic. I don't know, that also this is just pure speculation.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. When you say comparative literature, are you picking two specific literatures in two different languages? Praveen, what exactly are you doing?
Yeah, not really. The term comparison is always I'm used to this question being asked, and people have this idea that you compare two things. In Sinhala, the word is tulanatmaka, so we think of immediately a scale where you have these two different objects and you compare. But I'm not really comparing anything with anything. It's just the name of the field, I suppose. What I do study is mostly things to do with theory. So I study psychoanalysis and post-colonial theory and stuff like that, and I focus also on regionally, at least South Asia. So I do a bit of modern or 20th century South Asian literary and intellectual history, although I'm not a historian by any standard. Yeah.
This comparative literature I'm assuming, though it's not true, you're also looking at Sinhala literature, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So
So, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
like related to my research, a lot of the material that I engage with is in Sinhala. So I read materials in Sinhala and of course like English as well. And for like broader contexts, I also sometimes look at like some Bengali material, but I don't necessarily know how that would like fit in with a larger sort of agenda here.
So I find it very heartening to have somebody young who has studied in the English, the English field and the English department, also paying attention on the Sinhala fiction. Because correct me if I'm wrong, that is not very often done, is it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, yeah. Sorry, my mind is now going back to what we talked about in the Sinhala
No,
version
no,
of this. But
forget the Sinhala, because somebody who might
yes,
listen to this
yeah,
might be
I
a
mean,
foreigner who hasn't listened to the Sinhala at all.
yes,
You need
yes,
to,
yes.
you're repeating,
No,
don't worry
I
about
mean,
it, Praveen.
yes, what you're saying seems to be true to a certain degree, at least. There seems to be this sort of understanding. I'm yeah, it would be a separate conversation to really go into like the specifics of why that is. And I mean, we know why it is also, but yeah, I think there are people who also do it, but most people don't.
No,
Like I
and
think
the case is very different in India, if I'm correct.
yes,
There are many people
yes,
who write and research in English, pay a lot of attention on the like so-called vernacular writers. And
yes.
could you? I know you're not an authority on it, but why would that be, Praveen? Why would so much, like for example, the example I picked earlier was Gayatri Spivak, who discussed the Mahesweta Devi's writing that she did in her own language, right? And you very
Yeah.
interestingly pointed out, but she is also connected to English, right?
Yes,
But
Mahasudha Devi
yes,
also has an English degree, and I think
yes,
he taught English at a university as well.
right. But how come
But
in India there are so many scholars writing and researching in English who look at the native
yeah,
languages, and we don't have a similar situation here?
yes, I think like even in India, like from what I see, and yeah, from like the sense that we get, I think it also tends to differ regionally a lot. In terms of like like Indian academics in the US, like you mentioned Spivak, there seems to be like, for example, at least in like that Bengali speaking world, there seems to be a big correlation, a noticeable correlation between writers having studied English literature and then writing in Bengali. I think there are several people. Jibanananda Das is one other person, but there are so many people like that. And the situation is very different in Sri Lanka, where we see that there's almost this like a vast separation between like what we might call vernacular worlds and like the Anglosphere. But this is also, like we said, this is also kind of a myth, because the two are never really as separate as we would make it to be. But on the other hand, it's also sometimes true that these two spaces are conceived in terms of vastly different like worlds. But as we know, like throughout the 20th century and even before that, and even now, like even like endeavors like this, there is much more overlap than we sometimes would um, admit. But in India, it seems to be that like the spaces of intellectual engagement seem to be at least more polylingual than in Sri Lanka. And I mean, of course, like not to say that there are no like sort of post-colonial problems or language anxieties, but I don't think there is this sort of major language anxiety that's there in Sri Lanka,
I
especially
agree.
with
And
Sinhala.
though you did signal to the fact that we might be closer than you think, I fear,
Yes.
Praveen, watching what the media or the social media is showing us, which is now how we structure our life more or less. The revision seems very not only clear but very bitter as well. Not that it was never not bitter, with the English speaking people being called posh people, and the Sinhala speaking, like different terminology. So this dislike and the divide seems to be, if not in reality, at least in perception, quite solid. And therefore
Yeah.
endeavors like this, as you say, where we are trying to say, not really, like you came here to talk about a Sinhala academic journal, in English.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
I want the polity also, that discussion, the same thing in English to happen in Sinhala, to show that we really mustn't think this doesn't concern us, because it does, and it's closer
Yes.
than you think. So thank you, Praveen. Can we go to what Pravada means, please? What is
The meaning
Pravada?
of the word
Yes,
Pravada. No.
no. What the journal is. Yeah.
The journal. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So the journal started somewhere in like the early 90s, I think 1991. It was started by Charles Sabesekara, Kumari Javardhan, and Jayadeva Uyangbuda. And then in the beginning, I think Pravada was published both in Sinhala and in English. But then at some point, the English version started being called Polity, and the Sinhala version continued to be called Pravada.
And this was SSA, right? It was a publication
Yes,
by
it's
SSA?
published by the SSA, the Social Scientists Association. And in around 2003, I think there's a halt. Pravada stops, they stop publishing it. There seems to be a gap. But in about 2011, and from 2011 to 2013, there are few Pravada issues. But then it stops again. And during like the 2011 to 13 period, Professor Uyangbuda edits it mainly, and sometimes some other people also join him as co-editors. And this sort of the new phase of Pravada was started in 2019. Late 2019 is when the new phase was started, and that's when I started being associated with it. Right now, for the most recent ones, we've also very recently got Darshit Vardhaniya from the history department at Colombo on board to also be an editor. And currently, Harshani Fernando works as a coordinator for the journal. So it's a very small team, and it's a I know we talked about this. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult endeavor. It's a struggle. There's also no. It's interesting that in Sinhala there's a better sort of concept for how these things are done. And I mean, we don't think about words like this as conceptual or carrying sometimes conceptual weight. Yes. But in English, it's very hard to explain what it means to produce vernacular knowledge, because it's actually a gatagahaganayam. It's something that you tie together and kind of just piece together almost, and do much like for example, how we get electricity by like old turbines and stuff.
We were discussing the issues of translation, and the difficulty of carrying something from one culture to the other when the concept isn't there, right? So before I touch upon that, is Pravada translation based, or is our original articles also published? What is
it mainly focuses on original articles, but of course there are many translations as well. So if you look at the new volumes, there are like all of the volumes have at least one translated piece. I'm not sure if that's true of the most recent one, but translations do play a big part in it. And I mean, like, it's interesting that like translation doesn't sometimes actually mean the translation of a text that exists in English. It's also like a more fluid interchange of ideas from English, and because of the unevenness of what we sort of define as our conceptual world, we are constantly translating.
Right. My question is one thing I want to ask you, Praveen, is that there are some important or significant discussions that have been carried out in English, like say just basic things like sides orientalism. These are way old texts, right?
Yeah.
Or structuralism or post-structuralism or Derrida's deconstruction. Have these come through Sinhala to our discussion spaces, Praveen? They may be decades old in the West and have made a huge significant impact upon knowledge production and everything else practically. Have we, through our journals, done some translations in which we brought those concepts, ideas to Sinhala? Has that happened?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. What I'm going to say might sound different from what was said in the Sinhala thing, but I will try to synthesize the gist of it. I think there have been endeavors like this where people try to kind of do this task of this discourse exists, so these concepts exist somewhere, so it's almost like your duty to translate them into the vernacular languages, especially in a context where in Sri Lanka humanities education is mainly done in the vernaculars. So there is this sense of almost duty that these things also must be translated, and these things must be made available. And certainly that's an honorable enterprise. But I'm also very skeptical about this sort of practice, as you know, because sometimes I wonder, like, for what? Mainly because, like, we have this idea of like these concepts in the Western canon as reified products, as these solid objects that we import and have to impart. But I don't think this is necessarily the way in which the humanities knowledge has to operate, mainly because sometimes we think in, like, when we work within like these vernacular worlds, to say, for the lack of a better word, that somehow in the English speaking world, people must be really knowing these concepts, or really knowing what Derrida is all about, and be able to like summarize Derrida or Heidegger or Foucault. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So sometimes, and also when we have this attitude of, okay, in the West, these people have come, and these people have written these ideas, and now we should translate those, although we are late. We always get caught into this loop of playing catch up. So the point of vernacular scholarship, and I think translation, is not to play catch up. It's not to sort of reproduce a world of letters in Sinhala that's already there in English. No, like, because it's of course this task also should be done, but sometimes there is no way to do it perfect, right? So this also should be a space in which knowledge can be created. And like, vernacular is also an interesting word here. In Sinhala, we were talking about how there is no sort of nice equivalent. The word seems to be swabhasha, but swabhasha has certain like nationalistic connotations, and is like co-opted into this sort of project. But vernacular means, the word verna means homeborn slave in Latin. So much like the slave who sort of learns the master's discourse, although the master might not know the slave's discourse, the vernacular scholarship also has to perform this sort of thing. Like, the world of letters in Sinhala cannot be completely unaware of what's happening in English, because that's how the world works, unfortunately. So that will always happen, but it also should be an autonomous space in which ideas are created. And so, of course, people should be able to read in English as well. And that part of education, I think, is very important. It's not either or. It's not either Sinhala or English, because it will never work out that way. We have to try to
Praveen,
both, yeah.
I get what you're coming from. I get what you're trying to say. But in a context like Sri Lanka, okay, it's not that they simply cannot read in English. Say you have many people who can't do it, no matter how much they like to know these things. Then I get your point that we mustn't reify or consider this knowledge as static to be poured from one container to the other, right? But before we go into the realization of the liquidity of all knowledge, shouldn't at least a rough idea of what has been said necessary? Because to break any rule or to challenge it or to overcome it or go beyond it, surely the positioning should not be ignorance, but knowing what has been said before. And within that context, is there no necessity of transferring what was said to a culture that has no idea of what had been said?
Yes, exactly. No, what you're saying is completely true. That we have to cultivate a sense of understanding and awareness. But I'm also very suspicious of the way in which this is usually done, right? And we talked about this, about the attitude sometimes we have in Sri Lanka towards things like theory or theorists. We think that there are these figures, these great figures, so these great minds that might give us the key to all life or to politics or whatever that. But we have to be very suspicious of the way in which I think ideas flow, because it's never an innocent or innocuous process. It's always going to be caught up with various other kinds of power structures, markets, and so on and so forth. And like in the last discussion, we had this, we made this sort of joke, right? That where how a publisher like Verso, for example, how Verso, for example, really profits by selling left-wing publications to grad students, and how all ideas, even so-called like alternative progressive ideas, are always caught up in like university like structures, departmental structures, disciplinary structures, but also like market forces. And this is always going to be something that we deal with when we encounter ideas. But I don't think we really treat ideas like this. We kind of have this idea that the humanities has to be taught through like a textbook that takes you through structuralism and then post-structuralism. No, like what's more important is also methodology in the humanities, which is also, I know we didn't talk about this, but I think, of course, I must say that like I don't know, like Pandita, like I don't know these things much. It's just my like opinions. But from like when we were in university, but also I think now still, the focus on methodology in the humanities is really bad. And usually you see very often how people in the humanities, people studying literature, have this almost social science kind of frame. They might talk about like my methodology and my analysis and this rigid structure of research methodology that's applied to the humanities. So in a way, for like the world of letters, we sometimes don't really have a nuanced way of engaging with ideas and really thinking about methodology and how to deal with the flow of ideas. And this is something that we should really interrogate, and we should ask the question why we do vernacular scholarship. For what? Like, what are we really trying to achieve? And how would any reader benefit from these things? Like, what is the benefit of teaching anyone any idea in a university? Like why teach Derrida? Why like if we think Derrida should be translated, why? Right? Yeah. Like, of course,
Praveen, you might be homogenizing the target audience, Praveen, because everybody is different. Everyone who reads, like say, a journal would be different. So something that might work very well for maybe a university student might not work that well for somebody out there who wants to learn the language and is reading. So when you question why are we doing it, why do we, are you also running the danger of imagining a target audience which is more or less the same?
I mean, I'm not sure. Generally, when we speak about Pravada, I think I can talk about Pravada. We have a general idea about who our target audience might be. And it's not a homogeneous group, but there are at least some issues in common. But the question of why we translate, or why we should translate, or how we should deal with the problem of how knowledge is circulated and how there is no sort of pure or innocent practice of translation or the circulation of ideas, I think that's a question that can be also divorced from the question of target audience. Whoever the target audience is, this problem still persists. But yes, for Pravada, I think a lot of the, in terms of an imagined target audience, it's mainly university students, is like that's a big target audience. But of course, it's not limited to that. We would find like
I wasn't actually questioning you on that about Pravada, but generally,
yes, okay,
you know, yeah. So generally, like one fear I have, again, this is something we didn't discuss earlier, is that we seem to have decided for whom knowledge and progressing in knowledge acquisition belong. Yeah. And we seem to have completely cut off a particular group as not being part of it. Like, I don't know, say three-wheeler drivers or whatever. My point is our, like, and I think you agree with me, our definition of Shastriya, you know, intellectual production, maybe we can think of it in a broad-based way than we do now. Yeah. But if we are to do that, we might have to consider getting some, as you say, we might consider some basic theories as being, the Western theories as being some basic knowledge. We might, for example, the constructed nature of reality, which Saussure might have brought in, right? That is something that it's worth knowing, no matter who has produced it. But then do we have a conversation about the language and reality and all that? So that leads to practical problems in life.
I don't.
So those are
I don't
basic.
know if. Yes, I don't know if I'm like particularly whether I'm in any way like qualified to answer this question.
Yeah.
Because if we are really broadening the audience, like I of course think that so many other audiences have knowledge and constantly deal with knowledge. Like for example, like you mentioned tuk-tuk driver, three wheels. Tuk-tuk quotes, for example, it's its own form of discourse. I mean, I'm also partly like just being silly here.
Yeah.
So I don't
no,
think
this
that the
wasn't
field
a
of
qualitative judgment, but what I'm saying is something that, of course, there are different knowledge groups. Every group has their own core knowledge systems. But if we want to transfer something from one world to another, then shouldn't we be translating the basics as well?
Yes, but I like, again, like my problem is that, for example, like Derrida or Saussure, like if you mention these theorists, like I think that their like relevance has a particular function, and it's already like very limited to like in as far as a journal like Pravada can go, for example, it can exceed university spaces, and that's good. It has to, and like your channel can do that, but it's still not a form of like just radically decentralized knowledge systems, because for that then like we can just chuck Derrida out of the window. And like I personally don't think that these figures are that important in that sense. Like we don't have to.
I'll tell you why I think they are, Praveen. For example, the importance of words in politics right now. We seem to be carried totally in huge waves simply because of the words we know some people use, right?
Yeah.
Within those contexts, another way of realizing what's happening might be to think of socio as well. This is not socio to study because he's socio, right?
Yeah.
But to how you don't have something out there in which you label a word. You first develop the concept, and to the concept you label a word. So even like homosexuality, why is it then called unnatural? If we had three concepts sorting it out, what I'm saying is it has practical application, Praveen, and to discuss it within academic context and to give some of this knowledge across might give them a better critical facility in which to judge what is being said at maybe political level.
Yes, I suppose, but
that knowledge is important.
Yes, I suppose. I mean, I'm not opposed to that. But I'm just like constantly playing the devil's advocate. It's I think we also should be suspicious of knowledge. Like
of course
we shouldn't
of course, but that's a different that's a different thing altogether, Praveen, that we should be suspicious, definitely. And one thing that is problematic is we consider it almost sacred, some of these texts. And no, that's it's not a Vandanaman attitude that I'm talking about. We need to be critical, definitely, of whatever. And as I said, people like Arjuna Parakrama have shown us the academic sphere itself is hugely politicized, mainly by the colonial masters, so that what we produce don't even go in there sometimes, and is thrown out as Harshana said, the oral histories are not even considered knowledge in some, in context.
And also like the thing is that colonial master and of course like global empire, and these are related to various practices of surveillance and all of those things. But whenever the academy takes certain things up, like for example oral histories or any sort of other focus that was not there before, we really should, I think, ask the question about why the academy is doing this. Like if the academy here is encroaching on certain fields of knowledge, it's not necessarily an inherently good thing. So there are because it's always going to be tied up in other sort of processes. It means that it's going towards a niche, and it's formulating that niche. So I think that like just academia in general is something that's far more like not dangerous, but it's never something that's sacred, or it's not pure.
I
It's
agree.
always
That I agree.
dirty work.
Yeah.
And when translating, I think the critical question to ask is, what is our subject position within this global network of ideas and capital and data flows? And like when translating, we need to ask these questions. When thinking about the problem of vernacular scholarship, we have to ask this question about what are we doing with ideas? Why do we get what we do? And why do we think these are important? Like why is it that these theorists, so these people are important, which you also raise? But I don't think it's necessarily for some great insight that someone has. It also might be possible for someone who has no currency in an academic setting to have great insights. But that's precisely the problem. It's a problem of academic currency. So it's sometimes like when we associate figures and ideas, it's a problem that can be inscribed within the academy. So when translating, I think it's also good to have this idea that your audience is going to be limited in that sense, because otherwise I think it's too broad. And if you are thinking like on broader terms, then I think letters and reading is just, it's not done anymore. It's we have to move on to other forms. But then I'm completely useless to talk about this sort of thing.
Right.
So
Right. No, I get that. Right. Just hop back a bit, Praveen. I'm trying to get back into Pravada.
yes,
Yeah. So Pravada, you said it's mainly geared towards university students, right? How it's
yes. I mean, that is something we have in our minds. Like, who would be reading these things?
right.
It might be university students. But of course, one is surprised sometimes that other people do pick it up. And yes, but
Just to give an
university
idea of
students
what
would
is
be reading.
available, would you do me the favor of reading the contents page of one of those?
Yes, I will do that. What we read in the Sinhala version of this was
Six, I think.
yes, 36, and which I was a bit. I should say this again. I'm embarrassed like I was before, because there's something that I wrote as well. But in the like I have a small introduction. That's the thing that I wrote. So each volume we've gone with a very loose kind of theme. Actually, we've ordered this thing into a theme. But like when I read the articles, you will also see how it's more than like a coherent like object. It's more like a series of juxtapositions, because the articles are very different in terms of their content, but also their style and their genre.
Okay.
So first there is the introduction, which is called now I had to mentally translate.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, read it in Sinhala,
So
that's
it's
fine. Yeah.
ආවර්ජනය මෙලංකෝලියාව සහ කලකිරීම, like reflection, melancholia and කලකිරීම. I'm not trying to translate. Yeah. And the next one is a short.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you again. What happens then? What happens when we don't really hit the nail on the head with what we want to say? Because you said a lot about the liquidity of language and the importance.
Yes.
Right? What happens? For example, you said we get stuck with the term vernacular languages.
Yes.
Because the Subhasha doesn't quite carry the Subhasha is more political, more nationalistic.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah.
Kalakirima, what? How would you translate that into English? What happens, Praveen, when you're, in this process of trying to, and you made it a very clear point that it's not really transference of knowledge, it's recreating it here. Okay, even within that, what happens when you get stuck at word level like that?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not too concerned about this.
Okay.
Like, there's always going to be these slippages, these like sites of loss where something is lost in translation, but also sites of actual emergence where you translate something into Sinhala into English, but the way you've translated this word, it actually gives rise to something new.
Exactly, gain also.
Like, yes, that there's gain for sure. And also, like, we should mention this, a lot of the time, like when dealing with things like literary theory or theory in general, right, like the humanities, people, like if you look at a Sinhala text, usually it's paragraphs of Sinhala text, but also you have within brackets English words. Somehow we think of the English word as fixed and full, blessed with like abundant in meaning, in a way that the
Stable.
Sinhala isn't. So the English fills in to fill the lack that the Sinhala, the wound that the Sinhala leaves exposed. But like the English word also doesn't mean anything, especially out of context. Just because you plug the word there, it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
But also a lot of these theorists, the English text is also a translation from French or German or some other thing. So these things have, and they, like, for example, Foucault has a very different institutional life in the American academy rather than in 1960s France. So it, of course, or any of these people would and should have a different afterlife in Sri Lanka in 2022. That goes without saying.
Right. And that doesn't happen when we have that reverential way of looking at them, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I get that.
And I don't think we should be too concerned about what's lost in language. That's just something that, it's lost and you move on. And of course, in translation, when actually doing the real work of translation, there are ways in which I think you think through certain concepts. Like kalakirim, for example, the word kalakirim really doesn't have an English equivalent. But there's a way of like glossing through this term. I think Professor Gananatha Besekar has a good essay on this. I forget its title, but it's on, again, like psychology and like the word kalakiri. He looks at like people doing pilikul bhavana and stuff like that. But again, like, for example, we typically don't think of vernacular languages as having concepts that are of theoretical worth. We somehow think that theories is something that is fundamentally alien and something that should be sort of codified and taught or imparted, like it's imparted knowledge. But all languages have these strange points which like contextually emerge as concepts, and this happens with Sinhala. It can happen with any language. And I think this is something that we should really focus on when doing vernacular scholarship. How to think through Sinhala without, if we are doing in Sinhala or any other language for that matter, without writing in this dead sort of language that just tries to, like spell out what another language says. So yeah, I think Pravada tries to do this to a certain degree. Yeah. Sorry, Madhubhashini, I think you're on mute.
I myself have thought that sometimes Sinhala simply isn't equipped enough to handle some of the concepts expressed in literary theory in English. But you're giving a corrective to that look as well, saying, that's maybe not the way we should go. We should maybe transfer it into the way we already have, the language we have here to express that. But that's an interesting thought for me to follow, because I myself had thought earlier that we simply do not have enough words to get, I mean, at practical levels, definitely, if you talk about the glossaries we had before, Pariganaka, Mudanga, Dudanga, whatever, that's at a physical level. But for me, more problematic is the idea level that haven't been caught. Like even Jatiya, Jativadaya, Jati Katvaya, like nation, nationalism, ethnic groups, we get stuck even in that.
Yes. So, yeah, no, of course. I mean, yes, like part of the deal is like it's like concepts and ideas, I think, are formed always through a particular history and a context. And what happens many times in vernacular sort of intellectual production is that concepts and ideas are wrested out of their context and talked about in sometimes very decontextualized sort of ways. Or we always try to locate them in the context, in their original context, whatever that's supposed to mean. So as a result, what we are constantly doing is intellectual history and not theory. So we are not working with ideas. We are writing or learning about ideas. And that's, I think, a very different sort of thing. But like all languages have a particular, they can be used to generate concepts. Like even like a very simple word in Sinhala, like inna. Like the word inna, for example, is a very fascinating word. I'm not a Sinhala expert, right? But I think it comes from the word in Sanskrit, sidati, which is and the verbal root is sad, which means to like sink, to suffer, to die. So sindinama, hindinama, innama, to suffer, to die, to decay, to perish. And so it's very interesting that the word to be already has the connotations to die within itself. And these are, I think, connections. I mean, etymology is it's a stupid but fun game to do, but it's also like conceptually very rich. And like these are ways in which like vernacular, like thinking through the vernaculars, we can really engage with these things. Like as a sort of a joke, like I mean, people constantly talk about, like these great ontology thinkers of ontology, but no, like for example, like part of the deal of a thinker like Heidegger, for example, is also the fact that he's like a very poetic thinker. And of course, people have like critiques of like poetic styles of doing philosophy. But the point is that all of these people write in a particular language, and you can't mimic certain things and just then spell out, these are this person's ideas, this is what this person says. It misses the point. So if you are going to go about it that way, you might as well not do it sometimes. There's no point in doing that, because no one, and I don't know, like learn, like when I'm here, like what I really feel is that a lot of grad students like don't know and don't care. So we will always try to then play this weird sort of game of catch up, having this imagined ideal Western reader but no Western reader like that really exists. So I think what's really important is at a methodological conceptual level that we learn how to do scholarship in vernaculars. And that doesn't mean exclusively then being like, yes, now I work entirely in Sinhala, so I would just do that. No, Sinhala is a tiny language that's spoken in like half of one island. So it's not a question of either or again, but it's also a question of what you can do with that. Also not forgetting that there still are so many like primarily in Sri Lanka, like humanities education is done in Sinhala, in the southern part of the island at least, right? So we can't forget and just go on this like
Praveen.
elitist loop.
It's about making knowledge ours. It's about creating with engaging in creative ways rather than just getting it up there. It's a very interesting and I think valuable look at what education should be, because you might also be aware that's not quite the way we do that in schools or even universities sometimes. The engagement and the production. Yesterday I had a interview with Professor Neelika Malavige, and she said, science labs are there to experiment. At A level, but it's really not that even that anymore. It's more learn this and reproduce it. So this kind of talk about what education should be, you're doing actually the same thing in the humanities level of engagement, creating, and why learn what was. You got to apply to what is right now. It's a very interesting thing. Thank you, Praveen. Let's go back to the chapters.
Yes. Almost forgot about that.
I love the diversions because you learn so much through that. So don't worry about the diversions.
Yes. And the second one, the second article, so the second text in the volume is called Muavima Masked. I think there's an English version of the same short story. It's a short story by a writer called Puusathi Liyanarachchi.
My question, what is a short story doing in an academic journal, Praveen?
Yes, so this might be the time to actually talk about the kinds of writings that Pravada carries. In the write-up, it's in Sinhala, so we've said that this is a space for Shastriya, Ardha Shastriya, and Shastra Virodhi Lekana. So, and of course, in the Sinhala version of this, I also said somewhat jokingly that Pravada is a Shastriya Sangarava, but it's not an academic journal because it's unacademic by like the standards of what is typically considered to be an academic journal in like the West. Like there's no we have a review system, right? It's edited and it's reviewed typically, but it's not this kind of like double blind peer review, for example. But just for the purposes of making sense, let's take Shastriya to mean academic. So like standard academic pieces, we do carry standard academic pieces in the humanities and in the social sciences. But we also do like more critical, like critical scholarly pieces are also done. Semi-academic pieces that might be journalistic, that might be somewhat poetic, and we also do like Shastra Virodhi is like anti-academic. So, and of course, this is going to be hard to define, but it's exactly anti-academic. But it also relates to a particular understanding of what we think of the academy itself and how vernacularity is positioned in this larger global network that comes to be called the academy. So yes, we are. It's an open space. So you have all of these things. So the creative pieces typically would have some sort of critical potential. That's why they have been included. And like some of them can be like more like creative / journalistic, documentary ish. The most recent volume has a piece by Abdul Halik Aziz, who's an artist called World Class City, which is like a very interesting description of Colombo, for example. But it's a creative piece, but it's also, it performs a certain critical and intellectual task. And the same with Pusati's short story. The next articles are in Sinhala. This is called Patriyeshana Prashnapodi, which is a translation of an English article, which I translated. It's by Vagisha Gunasekara. The English one is called Unpacking Baggage, a reflection on the battle over ideas and labor hierarchies in collaborative North-South research. So it's very related to our current conversation. It's about how research actually happens in a particular market, and also a network of power relations that encompasses really the entire world. And like, for example, even when you look at what sort of knowledge has been written on Sri Lanka, what sort of how is Sri Lanka Sri Lanka? It's because of a particular knowledge, because Sri Lanka has been constituted through certain kinds of disciplinary apparatuses. We understand Sri Lanka as a particular kind of space, mainly because of ideas. So this piece really like questions things like this. So it's a great piece for even our conversation right now.
Right. Please put the link between when the video comes up on Tuesday, Praveen. Please put that link below it. And also just give us some idea of who Vagisha is. Then we'll realize how important her intervention is.
Yes. So Vagisha was the director at the American Institute for Sri Lankan Studies. And I think she was affiliated with several other like research NGOs, like think tanks, sort of things. So this is written from her personal experiences working for these research organizations. So it's important that I think when you are
it's very rare that within the academic spaces we talk about the politics and the the capitalist market forces that are within it. So that kind of self-reflection, I think, is very valuable.
Exactly. Yes. The next piece is also exactly like that. It's by Kaushala Pereira, who is in the English department at the University of Colombo. And it's on World Bank money that's circulating in local universities through like these ahead grants. I think we call them grants, but they're really loans, which we talked about, and which Kaushala also writes about.
So it goes back to my power of words. Why we should know that words can cover so much of things that shouldn't be. We call it a grant, but it needs to be paid back, right? So that this kind of the danger of words can be made more aware to many people if we read people like Socio or whatever, Safir Wolf or whatever. So that this is why I think that this is basic knowledge that should go to everybody. But let's not go back into that discussion. So but the danger of words is something that as academics we should really pinpoint to. Politics was run on words now. So it's that dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree with you. But let's not go back.
Let's not go back there. Yes.
Yes, the next one is an article by Samal Vimukti Hemachandra, who's at the history department in Colombo. It's on an insurgent, a female insurgent during the 71 JVP uprising called Chandrakka. Yeah, so it's mainly a history related write-up. It's like a standard academic piece, and the last one is an interview by an interview with the historian Sanjay Subramaniam. Yeah, so it's a very diverse range of texts that have been sort of juxtaposed and organized around a particular kind of theme. Yes.
So that's all in Sinhala and accessible on from where, Praveen? Which website should they go to refer to this?
Yes. So it's on the Social Scientists Association website. If you, it's sssalanka.org. If you just type Pravada, but in Sinhala, if you type Pravada, maybe if you type it in English also, it will just pop up. It doesn't. Pravada private label and Pravada flows.
Yeah.
I don't think it's called Pravada. It's pronounced
No,
Pravada.
so
Maybe from
it's
Sri Lanka, if you just Google Pravada, it might come.
yeah. In
But
the
if you go to
future,
the
in this program, Pradeep Piris, who is now the director of SSA, will come and introduce what SSA is. And then very soon, the deputy editors of Polity, Skandakumar and Chulani, will come and speak about that. So by that time, people will get a very good idea of what SSA is and what it does. And also, just to say that it had some of the best social scientists in Sri Lanka, Kumari Javardhan, Huyangoda sir, and all those people. So it's important that we know about that space as well. So your talk today is about the Sinhala Journal, right?
Yes.
So also I will put the link of that underneath the video, Praveen.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Access to it. You were talking, before we finish, the very fact that you're dealing with Sinhala has a different host of problems, right? On technicalities. That makes your Gatagahagana Yama even more problematic, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about this also, that how and like you have experience with this as well, right? Like doing this program, but also in your, I'm sure, like other translation work and just writing in general, it takes so much more time to actually do the basics of editing or writing in Sinhala. It takes more than twice the amount of time that one would take to work in English. Mainly because of, like, even at the level of word processing, or like just when writing you forget a word, and in English you just Google it, and in Sinhala it's sometimes not that straightforward. And
my example I gave, Praveen, is some of my Atharamadhyava channel interviews. There are newspapers willing to publish it, and the delays because you need to transcribe. In English, all I have to do is go to YouTube, and there are 3 dots, and I say transcription, then it comes. All I have to do is proofread. Of course, that is necessary, but I might take 3 or 5 hours to do one interview, say. But for the Sinhala, obviously there is no option. My only option is to run it and physically write down. So there is a Sinhala paper willing to actually publish it on their website, these interviews. The delay is on my part. The physical act of doing it takes probably 3 days.
Or more. I think probably. It might. I think it would take way more if you were to actually like take this, clean it. It might sometimes also involve other people. Like you might have to get someone to do this, and then
even that someone who can commit that much of time and dedication. I mean, since I am passionate about it, I can think of doing it, right? I wish there were people who I could ask for help. But the thing is, it's so much physically more difficult to do it in Sinhala because we don't have the technology that developed, or because we're a developing country and all that jazz. It makes it so much harder.
Do
the same things in this language. So I can imagine how even the process of typing, my almost exclusively in English, because what I can do in 2 minutes, I would take much longer to do the same thing in Sinhala.
Exactly, yes. And for Pravada, for example, most of the time, like now I think this is slightly changed. Publishers do take printers do work with Unicode as well. But it's typically printers deal with Sinhala font. But online, for anything that's online, you would have to use Sinhala Unicode, and these two things are two completely different kinds of I don't know, technology. I'm bad at this sort of lingo. So the process of actually converting these things. Sometimes people submit articles written in Sinhala font, and then to have that go up on the site, if it's in English, for example, you just proofread it and it's up. In Sinhala, you proofread it, and then you have like whatever your discussion, you run it by them, and then you have to convert it into Unicode and then clean the entire text. And this takes days sometimes to do it properly.
It does.
Also, Word doesn't underline Sinhala like Vyakarana dosha, like
it underlies the whole thing. Yes.
Yeah, it underlies the whole thing. So you have to be like careful with these things, and even like at the level of like editorial decisions, like do we space out these like this and years and verse, like it demands a certain kind of consistency, and these are decisions that you wouldn't encounter when dealing with English.
Exactly. Yeah, whether to space the year or whatever, those little things you have to know. Praveen, this is a question I didn't ask in the Sinhala, maybe I should have. What made you, as an English department student, be interested in Sinhala so much that you ended up as like the editor of a Sinhala Shastriya Sangrahaya or a Sinhala academic journal? What made you look at it? Is it your background or is it your curiosity? What made you straddle both worlds? It's very rarely done.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. This would involve introspection, which is always painful.
I can imagine.
So
no, just your childhood. For example, my PhD was a comparison between post-war Sinhala and English literature. So very clearly, I can say it's because my childhood had both literatures. Very clearly, because of who my parents were. So you can be at a very shallow level like that, Praveen.
No, I mean, yes. I mean, I grew up with both languages. What I typically speak at home is Sinhala. I do, but it's not to say that. I mean, English is also a language that like both my parents speak. So it's something. So I did grow up with both languages, and I grew up reading in both languages, and I have been just generally interested in languages as well. I grew up in Kandy, and for example, like as opposed to in Colombo, for example, in like interactions with Tamil were also like way more in Kandy. But then I lost the little bit that I had after coming to Colombo as well. But yes, I've always been interested in languages. So yes, I think it's actually that it's probably that simple. But I think it's also, this is a very common situation for even people in English departments, and people are equipped to do this, but it's sometimes other institutional and larger social structures that really prevent this. But it's also, I must say that I'm not saying that if you really want to, you can. So it's not like this weird like hero narrative that the people who do that. No, it might also be to do with certain circumstances that some people end up working with both. Like I think something that happened to me was that I suddenly got co-opted into doing so much translation that I just absolutely didn't want to do. But it also, I mean, it also pays bad. Translation pays bad. But this is something that I was really doing before coming here. But it's usually, because there are very, very few people who do academic translations now. Especially like my generation, there are very, very few.
I think so, very much so. So at least y'all are there, because one of the things I try to do here, which, as one person, it's minute speck that you can do, but I try to discuss some significant articles in English in Sinhala, because discussing it is much easier than actually translating it. So little way, even like books like Orientalism, at least to discuss them in Sinhala is at least to take that small step, because I don't think any single person can radically change anything, but those small steps might matter. And
I mean, you can loosely think about discussing it also as an act of translation, but also I think it also might afford the possibility of really recontextualizing a work like Orientalism, which is an old work. So sometimes, although these things might be translated, Orientalism, I think, would really make sense when you look at its location in also the American academy, written by Said, also in the context of what was happening with Palestine and all of that stuff. So sometimes just because Orientalism gets translated, it's not just a matter of it being available in the language, right?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
not just
The
a matter of
discussion.
words, it's also
Exactly.
the
Because
context.
if you take stereotyping, imagine the value of that word in 2021 Sri Lanka, 2022 Sri Lanka. What
Yes,
stereotyping
exactly.
has done and what it is doing now. So you're
Yeah.
right. More than the solid translation. I would still differ from you, Praveen, by saying both are necessary. I
No, of
wish
course. I'm
there
not
was a
saying
solid,
yes.
the solidity of that knowledge, which we now should interrogate. But
Yeah.
it makes the
Yes.
interrogation so much easier, the challenge so much easier if it was there for everyone to access.
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying like don't translating
Yeah,
don't translate it, just discuss it. But I think
yeah,
that like things that spaces like this or spaces like Pravada or any such sort of vernacular space can open up is precisely a possibility of actually building context, and context
yes,
building is very important.
absolutely. It's everything. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Because
so
there's
much.
no point in translating a random philosopher or random theorist and just sort of throwing it in.
I agree. And again, we
And
link to education. What are we educating people for?
yes,
Shouldn't be just memorizing and putting things out,
exactly,
you know?
exactly.
And
Yes,
that's a problem that our whole education system might need to address. Why are we, what is education for? If you
yes,
know, what are you doing? It's not simply passing or getting a certificate. So what is education is another huge theme, Praveen, which I think neither of us are qualified or anyone can't. But we can raise the questions.
exactly. Yes. And
So
there's
that,
also like, I think the necessity of, mainly in light of like what we talked about, like the circulation of knowledge and how like academic markets are structured. I think in Sri Lanka, it's also very easy to ignore the fact that academia isn't market based, perhaps because of like the state structure that we can
yes,
fall back on to.
yes, yes,
But it's not that we actually have a state structure as such. It's still implicated in these other various market practices, right? And
and now
so we
even more
sometimes
so. If you
even
look at
more
the
so.
Kupi talk, the Kupi group, that's they are
Yes,
pointing out to the dangers of the market forces now invading the space that had been, well, at least at the original level, more or less
yes.
autonomous, but now it's no more.
Exactly. And all like the circulation of ideas and the production of new ideas is always going to be about this. And I mean, this is not to also be too cynical, but a lot of academic books that get published, I mean, it's not completely divorced from the practices of getting a job, academic job in the market, getting tenure. It's always going to be bound with these things, about caught up in these things. And in such situations, I think that it's also important that like there are possibilities of academic or intellectual engagement, like spaces that are somewhat divested from the university. At least they can still be related, but there is some sort of freedom in moving out slightly, where you can actually vernacularize these spaces
Yeah,
to go
even
to like
within,
the.
though, Praveen, even within there are spaces now in which some kind of autonomous standing back
Of
is being
course,
done.
of
Yeah.
course, yes.
Okay, so let me thank you very much for the time you spent, like night for you, morning for
Yes,
me.
I'm
Uh,
getting a bit, yes, my brain is
I
getting a
can
bit cloudy
imagine.
now. Yes.
Thank you, Praveen. I really appreciate this for your discussion about Pravada, what it does, where to find it, and also generally about education in general and translation and what we should be looking at when we think of translation. I really value your ideas. Appreciate the fact that you came. So good luck. You can now
Thanks, Madhavan.
officially
Yes.
fall asleep. Thank you for
Yes.
your time. And
Thank you for inviting me
yes,
to your program as well. Thank
okay.
you.
Good luck with everything.
Thank
Bye.
you. You as well. Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.